Dr. John Bruni from Sage International has just walked through the door, rugged up for... Well, that's not rugged up, is it? I mean, that's a nice leather coat.
Oh, yes, I'm cloaked.
You are, indeed.
I'm in stealth mode.
Yeah, well, it does look rather spy-like, doesn't it? It's sort of trench coat.
It fits the whole persona.
Yeah. I love it. Russia's visit to Cuba, what do you make of that?
Nothing. Really, so much has been made of this in the media. It's incredible. The days of the Soviet Union are far gone. Russia today is a pale shadow of what the Soviet Union used to be in terms of military wherewithal. One has to recall that under the Soviet Union, Cuba was a staunch ally, provided all sorts of local assistance for Russian forces. At the moment, the Caribbean is not as it once was. There are no reachbacks to try to reinvent the old 1960s. So the Russian fleet is, bobbing up and around, looking as though it has global reach, but it has no logistical train. I mean, if the Russians were truly serious about scaring the United States, they would actually have come with a proper fleet, not with just a couple of boats and here we are, fly the flag. Yeah. They would come with the logistical capacities to actually stay in situ for a long period of time.
So it's not another Cuban Missile Crisis.
It is not. It's not even remotely. So no, nothing to worry about here.
You don't think he's sending a message, trying to send a message to...
Well, okay. Just on that, Jeremy, trying in parentheses, yes, he's trying to send a message. But the media is the only one running with this story. Anyone that knows anything about strategy is just looking at this saying, yep, okay, so they're there, big deal. What's happening? Nothing.
Yeah, so when you say that they're not a shadow of the Soviet Union... maybe the Soviet Union was a bit fanciful in itself. Maybe it wasn't the great big powerful machine that we thought it might be.
Well, as we've come to understand, our mythologizing of Russian forces generally comes from the Soviet Union. It doesn't come from modern Russia. But as the Ukraine-Russia war has demonstrated, the Russians are not 10 foot tall. They are not indestructible, and their command structure is riddled with incompetence. So, yeah.
And the whole economy, I read the other day, is about the size of Spain.
Yes. So you have to wonder, with all the international sanctions that have been placed on Russia, with the size of economy that it has, how much longer can it afford to keep cranking out the men and the material necessary to prosecute its war?
Les was... we were talking before the show, and Les suggested that the only reason the Americans are in Ukraine would be for the minerals, the trillions and trillions of dollars worth of minerals that are there to be exploited.
Look, the Ukrainians do certainly have resources. I mean... the low-hanging fruit would be the oil and gas fields in the Black Sea, which are yet to be fully exploited. The Russians want access to that, obviously for their own economic reasons. They want to have a monopoly on the provision of oil and gas to Europe. Yeah. The Ukrainians know that in a post-war situation, they need to have access to that so they can start paying back debts and also rebuilding their economy.
What do you make of this deal that's been done, 50 billion American dollars, 75 billion Australian dollars over a 10-year period, using the seized assets of Russia and applying the interest made therefrom to a benefit to Ukraine. I mean, it's got some sort of symmetry, hasn't it? Some poetry. Yeah. Will that work?
I think it will, and I think not enough attention has been paid to this. I think that of all the Western policies that have been thrown at this war, this was the cleverest of the lot. This was the one that's going to hurt Russia.
And they're going to pay for it with their money.
Yeah, exactly. But again, what can Putin do about something like this?
But is this legal? Can you seize somebody's bank balance and then give his worst enemy the interest?
Well, Jeremy, all I can say about that is in geopolitics, follow where the power goes, and that's legal, right? So if, for instance, Putin were to have swept into Kyiv and started throwing his weight around in other parts of Eastern Europe, and the West just was nowhere to be seen. The law will follow where Russia and Putin goes, right? So it really, in geopolitics, it's all about the power. Who has the power controls the legal interests, shall we say.
You're just back from all sorts of places. Poland?
Yes, Poland, yes.
What did you do in Poland?
Well, I was in Poland for the Strategic Arc Conference series held by the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I was a guest presenter on a panel on the Middle East. So we were talking about Israel-Palestine, and it was awesome, and it was very high-powered. I was sitting with the former Polish chief of defence staff, so that was pretty cool.
Are they nervous at all looking at Ukraine?
The atmospherics were actually quite interesting. Yes, they're worried about Ukraine. They're worried that the Russians are going to end up building up a head of steam and pushing through, and then threatening Poland.
Well, why would they stop at Ukraine?
Well, that's the theory, right? And also the Baltics are worried. And so that whole area of the Baltics up in the north all the way down to Poland in the south, they now form the front line, the western front line against Russia. Because whatever happens in Ukraine, the Russians may very well end up next year with a permanent forward position in Ukraine. I mean, there are attempts to develop a diplomatic solution to the crisis. If there is going to be a diplomatic solution, which I doubt anyway, because it's a presidential election year in the United States, nothing ever gets happened during that year. But say, for instance, something does in early 2025, it's likely to be a negotiated settlement pretty much along the current lines of Russian occupation, which means that around 18% of Ukraine will be permanently under Russian occupation, which was really what Putin's plan B was anyway, when he was knocked out of Kyiv. But the thing is, if you're a Russian veteran, brutalized, underclothed, underfed, and in every way mistreated, and you saw your colleagues being killed left, right, and center for 18% of Ukraine. I mean, I could imagine that the Russians would be going huzzah if they would have made it all the way to the west, to Lviv, the Ukrainian city of Lviv, and conquered the entire territory. That would be a win. But a win of 18% is not much of a win. So I'm curious as to how Russian veterans will view this if this does come to pass. Now, it is a big question mark at this point in time. We don't know for certain, but if the diplomats have anything to say about anything, they will be quite content with the Russians and Ukrainians packing up their rifles and going home, but keeping the border areas as they are currently confabulated.
Well, it's a very expensive 18%, isn't it, when you consider all the sanctions?
Exactly.
And all the very bad public relations that is being heaped on Putin.
Yep.
I mean, he at the moment is the devil incarnate, isn't he?
He is, and he can't get away from that. I mean, that sort of reputational stink will carry on with him for the rest of his time in the Kremlin.
Yeah. Which do you think will be long?
Well, again, that really comes down to the veterans themselves. Assuming that our hypothetical, that there is going to be some sort of diplomatic settlement in the early part of next year, those people who come home who have fought the war are going to be asking whether the sacrifices that they had made was worth 18% of Ukraine, because what they were promised was total victory. They didn't get it. They got at best now what would be considered a frozen conflict, with the borders as they are currently seen on the map in place, and we don't know for how long. Because again, going back to the economic damage of Russia, we in the West have this idea that Russia somehow is like the Soviet Union in World War II, that manpower is no object, that they can churn out the artillery just like they did back in the old days. They can't. This is a mythologizing made by our media. We're trumpeting what the Russians are actually giving to us because they mythologized their role in World War II, and they say, well, look, we are 10 foot tall and we can mass produce things that the West simply can't, and we can do all of this. But the sad fact is they're part of the international community of nations, which means that their economics is pretty much wedded to the same way of our economics. And if we have a hard time mass producing stuff, the Russians are also having a hard time. Why would they reach out to a place like North Korea or Iran for weapons if they were so confident in their capacity to produce war-winning material?
Yeah, interesting. The politics of Europe. What were the politics of Poland like when you were there? What did it feel like? It seems that a lot of these countries are moving to the right or the centre right, and there are many elections this year which will produce an interesting result, I would think.
Well, it was interesting because while I was there, I was also, as were the rest of the participants, we were all guests of the President of Poland. We went to the presidential palace and we heard President Duda actually speak. Now, President Duda is not really far right. He's taken Poland from the far right and brought it back to the centre, which is great. Because, of course, of all the countries in Europe at the moment, the one that you really want to have to look at is Poland, because there is that substrata of things can go really badly wrong for democracy in Warsaw. And if it does, that will be the poison chalice that the West will have to deal with moving forward. But they are highly capable. I think that just walking the streets of Warsaw, I will say that there is a level of calm which I found rather surprising. People are going about their daily life as, everything's okay. But when you get the national security elite together, and I was fortunate enough to be among them, and you heard what they had to say, they are both worried about the future, but they are also extremely, extremely angry at the political elite of Europe. And what do I mean by that? Well, you've got a level of people who do know their craft, soldiers, sailors, airmen, officers of the highest order. They've been in NATO for God knows how long, doing their jobs, serving their countries in a professional capacity. When they go to their political leaders and they say, look, guys, we've got a problem here and you need to start taking our lead, these political leaders are not interested in what the military have to say. They're quite content with just going about their business and expecting that eventually things are going to return to normal. And what do I mean by normal? Normal as in the pre-Russia-Ukraine war days, that we can start trading with Russia, that our relations with Russia are going to be normalised in some capacity, and everything will go back to normal. Kind of like Australia thinks that we're going to go back to normal with the Chinese. And this leads on to another topic. But the fact is that there is this palpable sense of anger and frustration because, you see, when you wear the military hat and you see a war, you do see things differently. You do see things from an existential perspective. And, the Russians are the most, at least on paper, they have the most nuclear weapons, and it is a worry, and it is a concern, and it should be. But when your political leaders are just, treading water, and they're just thinking, we'll just give the Russians enough time. We've got enough sanctions on them. The pressure will work, and eventually something will happen to keep Putin in power, but make him really, really weak. It was a sort of strategy that we used with Saddam Hussein during the 1990s. Box him in, keep him sort of like in his little area, and eventually, he'll play ball. He'll realise that the West is all powerful. And
we put him in there, didn't we?
Well, we did, yeah. And I think that there is a similar kind of mentality among the West's political elite, and that's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee. And we need to look at the Russian threat a little bit more seriously and what its implications are for the European balance of power. Yeah?
Technologically, though, the Americans would have to be way ahead of anything that they've got in Russia. What I'm thinking of, and I think we've talked about it once before, when that in the USSR, when that Air Force pilot took the Foxbat.
Oh, yeah.
To Japan, He defected, went to Japan. Yeah. He got political asylum. The Americans couldn't wait to get their hands on this. Gee whiz! Next future generation of the jet, which I think was based on the Tomcat, the American Tomcat. But when they actually looked at it, it was just so 1950s.
Bare bones.
And basically it was a fuel tank with wings and a wooden dashboard. Nothing, how you were supposed to.
That's the way the Soviets used to produce things, and in many ways the Russians tried going a different route at the end of the Cold War, but the problem with that was they realised they didn't have the capacities to do that, so they had to reach out to Western arms suppliers to help with working out the electronic systems, the optics of various weapons as well. Once the sanctions hit the Russian war machine, they had no access to that level of technology. Right. So the stuff that the stuff that they had, like the T-14 Armata tank, for instance, latest and greatest thing that came out of the Russian stables. Well, it's a bit pointless if you have this thing and you cannot reproduce it because you don't have half of your capacity to produce the tank is located overseas in countries that are now sanctioning you, right?
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah. Les wants to ask you a question. He said, "Do you mind if I stick my head in and ask him? Go for it. Or do you want to come and sit in the chair?"
Oh, whatever's easier. I can sidle next to John.
Yeah.
So the couple of questions, John. One is regarding the prisoner exchange program that's going to be happening on Sunday. You're aware of that one?
No.
The Wang and Funi.
That prisoner exchange program.
Dear.
I understand they're being relocated for retraining.
Yeah.
But why would the
There's a place
Chinese...
in Western China for that, apparently. Yeah.
But why would the Chinese premier himself come to town, to the zoo, to make an announcement? Why wouldn't you just send an email?
To measure up the foot rugs, I don't know. But the question really is not about that. It's more about the case of the whole Chinese presence in South Australia, particularly the Joslin Embassy, which I understand has 10 diplomats. We don't have too many embassies here in Adelaide. And the Chinese one is allegedly processing visa applications. But why does China need 10 diplomats? And I guess a question I have for you is just a quick update on the position of that embassy in terms of what they're doing. Have you got any inside information?
Well, in terms of inside information, I can honestly say I don't think anyone has any inside information on any Chinese embassy anywhere in the world. The idea of having 10 diplomats doing processing here in Adelaide, that's an interesting one. I suppose one could say that if I happen to be of Chinese descent, I'd be worried about that. Those diplomats will be more in a monitoring capacity as opposed to a paper-pushing processing capacity.
But isn't it a listening post?
Well, yeah, exactly right.
Absolutely bristling with technology.
Well, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, are running a surveillance state in China. So, of course, it is only natural that all their ambassadorial outposts are going to be listening posts to ensure that local Chinese communities are not saying anything anti-Chinese, anti the state.
Did they build it, by the way?
Oh, yeah.
Because I suppose you couldn't really trust the local...
Australian contractors to put in their bugs and... no.
It's literally a fortress.
Yeah.
It's a fortress, 3 metre high walls surround the buildings. It's a large encampment in a suburban area, I might add. I've seen it. I've been
in little old Adelaide. Well, I suppose if you look at it from the perspective that South Australia is the defence state of South Australia, the defence state of Australia, it makes sense. But really, it's a bit overkill for a small town.
And look, my second question or commentary from you is about the Abraham Accord.
Yep.
And I understand that in 2020, Jared Kushner was partly or mainly instrumental under the Trump administration to put that accord together. And that was the basis of saying, well, Judaism and Islam were connected by the prophet Abraham, and there should be coexistence in terms of peace.
Yep.
And we know that these agreements, whilst they might suggest a social and religious harmony, often have trade implications at the very heart and backbone. But my question and comment to you is, or comment from you, is asking, what nowadays is the strength of the Abraham Accord?
Wow, Les, that's a great question. I would say there is still a lot of hope that the Abraham Accords can be consolidated and expanded outwards to include Saudi Arabia. The complicating factor, of course, is the ongoing war between Netanyahu and Hamas. This complication has done something that was probably predictable to most people looking at the Middle East, and that is that we all heard of the Arab Street. The Arab Street is not representative of Arab leadership. Arab leadership can take very pragmatic steps forward and understand their role in a wider world. The Arab Street is a febrile environment where as soon as they see a headline that happens to be anti-Arab or can be perceived as anti-Arab, they charge out into the street and they're protesting and doing all kinds of things. The current, and I do say Netanyahu-Hamas war because I do not subscribe that all Israelis believe that Netanyahu is right in prosecuting this war. I think most Israelis are right in saying that Israel had a right to defend itself. How it's defending itself at the moment,
That's a question.
that is the question, right? So if there's anything that's going to be undermining the Abraham Accords moving forward, it's the way that Netanyahu is prosecuting this war. He has now given a gift to those people who hate each other for another 2 or 3 generations moving forward. There is nothing to suggest that the children who have survived the Israeli onslaught after October 7 are not going to be radicalized and are not going to join groups like ISIS or Hamas 2.0 or whatever else and pose a continuing threat to Jews everywhere and also the state of Israel. This is a problem.
Yeah, because you talk about Hamas as if it was conquerable. It's
It's an idea. You can't conquer the idea.
It's an ideology.
Right.
And I note that the news last night was that, and the comment I make is it appears to me that the Australian government is conflicted about this because whilst Albanese will say, well, I don't support the war, I don't want the war to occur, Penny Wong has offered now further financial support to Hamas. Now, everyone's saying Hamas is a terrorist organisation. That's recognised all over the planet, but it's being funded. And so
Look, Les, it's interesting, but I like looking at history to guide our analysis moving forward on this. Just as the Nazis were the only dominant political grouping in Germany that provided everything from power, electricity, food supply chain within Germany, all of that was dependent on the Nazis. The same deal happened to Hamas in Gaza. Gaza's a small place. And let's not forget the fact, and Netanyahu has been on the public record saying it, he was instrumental in supporting Hamas and Gaza splitting away from the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority because he believed that divide and rule was the best way of managing Israel's affairs with the Palestinians. So there are no real squeaky clean innocent parties in all of this. Netanyahu, of course, is underselling his own role in a lot of the disaster that we're currently seeing right now. So I can understand why there are at least 50% of Israelis who are hopping mad and want the guy out to have more rational leadership, because what's happened as a consequence of Netanyahu's war is that Israel's reputation has been completely and utterly tarnished.
Well, more to come. Dr. John, thank you very much for coming in. How do we listen to your podcasts and all the other Sage things?
All right, well, if you go to www.sageinternational.com.au, you'll find all our podcasts, our articles, and all the events that we've been involved with. Yeah?
Thank you, sir. Dr. John Bruni, ladies and gentlemen.